All right, good afternoon. I'm Jessica Berg. I'm the Dean here at Case Western Reserve School of Law, and it is my privilege to introduce our 2019 Melman Lecture. The lecture is endowed to honor Professor Maxwell J. Melman, the Arthur E. Peter Silge Professor of Law. Max joined the university in 1984 and in 1987 became the director of our Law Medicine Center, following Ali Schroeder, who founded the center. In 2013, Professor Melman was named a Distinguished University Professor. It is the university's highest honor. His extraordinary work here at Case Western Reserve University prompted a very generous anonymous donation by the family of an alumna in the class of 1998. It established this name lecture series in health law, allowing us to bring in high-profile speakers in health law, all of whom are graduates of our law school. I am delighted to introduce our 2019 Melman lecturer, David Dvorak. Mr. Dvorak is the chairman of the board and chief executive officer at DeepThink Health Incorporated. It is a technology innovator in advanced analytics and artificial intelligence for precision medicine. He's previously served in various executive positions with Zimmer Biomet Holdings, including as president and CEO. And before joining Zimmer, he served as senior vice president, general counsel, and corporate secretary of Steris Corporation. Early in his career, he practiced corporate law, focusing on mergers and acquisitions and on securities law. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration and Finance from Miami University and a JD from our school here, magna cum laude, where he was elected to Order of the Coif. This promises to be an extraordinary, interesting topic, incredibly timely, and I'm very pleased to turn the podium over to Mr. Dvorak, who will be our 2019 Melman Lecture. So, thank you.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate everyone making the time for our discussion this afternoon. Hippocrates, a Greek physician from the 3rd and 4th century BC, conveyed important health rules through now famous quotes. Several from over 2,000 years ago have proven both accurate and prophetic. One of them reads as follows: "It is far more important to know what person the disease has than what disease the person has." Exogenous factors such as genomics, behavior, and social and environmental influences are now understood to play a critical role in delivering patient outcomes and value. Medical and technological advancements of just the past 15 years could leverage this understanding in a manner that transforms the diagnosis and treatment of patients. By capturing and structuring large genomic, clinical, and other data sets, and then applying advanced analytics and machine learning, actionable insights can be generated. This data-driven intelligence can facilitate the practice of precision medicine and the discovery of new patient treatments. But we're in the very early days of applying big data and technology to healthcare in comparison to many other industries. Though not insurmountable, several conditions are challenging the pace of adoption of these technologies and practices in healthcare. Over the course of our time together this afternoon, I'll attempt to describe at a high level the key advancements enabling this potential transformation, as well as the potential benefits and challenges associated with the adoption of precision medicine in cancer care. The transformational opportunity discussed today is certainly applicable to disease categories beyond cancer, given the fact that 1 in 3 of us will develop cancer at some point during our lifetimes. However, it seems to be an appropriate disease for purposes of our discussion. Finally, today we'll focus on data found in 2 large areas. The first, genomic and molecular data sets, and the second, clinical real-world data sets derived from electronic and other digital health records. My prepared remarks should not take more than about 30 minutes, and the balance of our time will be reserved for an open discussion. So let's begin with a brief overview of each of the three key medical and technological advancements. It's important to note that these breakthroughs and developments have all essentially come about over the past decade and a half. First, we'll consider the breakthroughs in genomic sequencing and the related accelerated development and approval of drugs. The Human Genome Project published a version of the human genome just 15 years ago. Today, a number of companies are in the market with full genome sequencing platforms designed for both research and clinical use. Until the late 2000s, the commonly referred to target cost for sequencing was about $1,000. Now, companies are striving to reach targets as low as $500 and even $100. These cost reductions, combined with the fast turnaround times, have helped expand the use of genomic sequencing beyond research to clinics. So, genomic sequencing data is becoming an extraordinarily important tool in diagnostics and in guiding therapeutic intervention. In addition, drugs for the treatment of the seriously ill who are out of other options, such as late-stage cancer patients, are being discovered, developed, and released faster than ever. It's important to recognize that the term accelerated is relative. Traditional drug development can take 9.5 to 14 years, while expedited drugs can take 5.5 to 11 years, so about a 3 to 4 year difference. Accelerated approval of drugs is becoming the new normal as regulators attempt to strike the best balance that they can between developing evidence and giving patients access to new treatment options. Consider these statistics. The FDA approved 43 new drugs last year through the so-called fast-track programs, as compared to only 10 a decade earlier. 73% of all approved drugs came through fast-track programs, compared to only 38% 10 years ago. In this context, proof of effectiveness is increasingly shifted to surrogate indicators, such as tumor shrinkage, or other measures of a drug's positive impact. These surrogate indicators are considered predictors of a survival benefit. Post-market follow-up studies are then required to confirm an actual clinical benefit. In the end, these accelerated approvals are premised upon the belief and hope that more comprehensive proof of effectiveness will be developed after a drug becomes available to the market. The next driver is the adoption of digital health records and real-world evidence. Automating clinical workflows through the implementation of electronic healthcare records was legislated 10 years ago, and the creation of a digitized patient record is absolutely fundamental to transforming the way healthcare is delivered. At the same time, we've seen growing acceptance of real-world evidence and a recognition that health outcomes are multifactorial. The FDA defines real-world evidence as essentially all relevant healthcare information derived from sources outside of typical clinical research settings, including electronic medical records. Real-world evidence is used most commonly by pharmaceutical companies, payers, and providers to make decisions about cost effectiveness and comparative efficacy where other data sources don't exist. But real-world evidence is also starting to be accepted by regulators, physicians, and patients for healthcare-related decisions. Situations that support real-world evidence are typically characterized by a lack of other therapeutic options, where the condition is seen as a life-threatening disease, such as cancer. Finally, computer science technology, now rather miraculously, enables us to capture, structure, and curate these large data sets, then analyze the data and transform it into intelligence. Machine learning, which is a form of artificial intelligence, is one of the particularly important technologies in this context. It is not predicated on a predefined parameter or rules. Rather, it involves adaptive learning. Exposure to new data allows an algorithm to grow better at recognizing patterns over time. Where human brains can learn complex associations from small bits of information, machine learning requires many more examples to learn the same task. In other words, machines are slower at learning, but have much greater operational capacity. These models can be trained on tens of millions of electronic medical records with hundreds of billions of data points without lapses in attention. Physicians may only see a few thousand or tens of thousands of patients in an entire career. Deployed correctly, machine learning can offer physicians the collective wisdom of billions of medical decisions, patient cases, and outcomes to inform diagnosis and treatment. So, how can these breakthroughs power the practice of precision medicine and forge the future of cancer care? Well, for centuries, medicine has commonly been practiced as a one-size-fits-all solution. Trial and error efforts often result in suboptimal outcomes and unnecessary costs. Precision medicine is defined as an emerging approach for disease treatment and prevention that takes into account individual variability in genes, environment, and lifestyle for each person. The main difference between traditional and precision medicine is the degree of reliance on data to make decisions about specific treatment paths for the individual patient. The three described medical and technological advancements have made such reliance both feasible and cost-effective. By combining genomic with clinical, and then applying analytics to these integrated data sets, healthcare providers and researchers can observe patterns in the effectiveness of particular treatments. Factors such as genetic variations that may be correlated with success or failure can be identified. Turning the specific patient data into intelligence and then integrating that intelligence into clinical workflows will allow the treatment plan to be specifically tailored to the profile of the individual. And these technological enablers will only become more important going forward. The natural limits of individual knowledge are likely to become a growing problem for frontline clinicians. These individuals will need to synthesize, interpret, and apply an ever-expanding mountain of medical knowledge stemming from the exponential rate of new discoveries. At some point in the future, keeping up with the pace of these discoveries will become humanly impossible without the aid of technology. Precision medicine requires reliable analysis of deep, broad data sets that include genomic and other molecular data, as well as clinical data about patients' journeys and outcomes. And companies providing precision oncology support face many challenges in building and integrating these data sets. First, genomic testing labs don't have to share their data in an easily usable electronic format. They view the electronic format as proprietary. As a result, companies that use this data have to go through several more steps to structure it to make it usable. And the growth of different kinds of genetic and molecular testing of tumors and cancer patients will only exacerbate this challenge going forward. Today, a patient is more likely to have genetic testing to identify late-stage treatment options. In the future, more patients will undergo early screening and early detection, and cancer patients will potentially have multiple tests over time to look for tumor changes and treatment response rates. Therefore, these data sets are going to grow rapidly. Second, and perhaps the single most significant barrier to developing optimal models, is the scarcity of high-quality clinical data. These models can only be as good as the data they are provided, and the adage garbage in, garbage out applies here in a major way. The data sets reside in silos and in multiple electronic health record systems across hospitals. Further, in the rush to comply with mandated standards, the implementation of these electronic health record systems has often resulted in digitized records with valuable clinical information in an unstructured format. As a result, some of the most critical data is buried in unstructured forms somewhere in pathology, radiology, and lab reports, and even in physicians' notes. Although today's technology, specifically natural language processing, can help capture some of the key data fields, the rest is left to manual abstraction by trained registrars. Obviously, this process takes precious time and is both cumbersome and expensive. The matter is only further complicated by the fact that many of the largest health systems have been formed through mergers over time. Therefore, these institutions are likely to be operating on multiple electronic health record systems. Even those with the same vendor often lack standardization across their various sites. All of this makes it extremely difficult to aggregate high-quality patient data even within one single system. And as you can imagine, these intra-institutional challenges are greatly magnified when the privacy-protected genomic and clinical data held by one entity is to be combined with the privacy-protected data held by another. Again, none of this is surprising when you consider the history of these electronic health record systems. They've in fact come into existence largely over the last 10, 20 years. So, although the technology exists to create the ideal learning systems, in the near term, sufficient resources will be required to abstract and curate the data needed to pursue these systems. Precision medicine is poised to improve decisions across the healthcare system. Expanding its use, however, will require multi-stakeholder collaboration. And these stakeholders, in turn, desperately need point-of-care tools to support patient-specific diagnostic and treatment decision-making. Payers generally don't want to reimburse the test if the test won't lead to what they believe is an actionable outcome. And many payers believe that actionable outcomes are dictated solely by FDA approvals and clinical practice guidelines. Unfortunately, these decision models don't cover the majority of cancer patients. Without tools that can support decisions relative to this majority of patients, payers are left guessing about the most appropriate diagnostic and treatment strategies. Complexities exist with on-label use of drugs as well. When those drugs were approved through the FDA's fast-tracked programs, questions arise concerning the medical and the financial value of these drugs, in part due to their limited track records. Remember, these drugs are often approved based upon surrogate indicators, which are considered to be predictors of a survival benefit. Let's take a look at some numbers. Of the past 42 fast-track cancer drugs approved by the FDA in the years 2015 through 2018, only 19% had proof upon approval that they significantly prolonged overall survival. 19%. Even further, of the fast-track cancer drugs approved from 2011 through 2014, so these are ones that have been on the market for about 3-4 years longer, 44% still don't have this proof. Now, the point here is not to be critical of the FDA and its fast-track programs. Rather, the agency's efforts here should be applauded, in my view. After all, these drugs are an attempt to treat patients who are oftentimes out of other options. But these statistics highlight the inherent and complex medical and financial tensions in this area. Government and private insurers, as well as patients, are paying for expensive treatments that aren't always effective. More importantly, at times, patients are being exposed to unnecessary side effects. Considering all of this as it applies to treating physicians is even more disturbing. Today's electronic health record systems simply do not provide a comprehensive point-of-care support solution for precision medicine programs. Further, without support tools, the pace of innovation in oncology will make it almost impossible for practicing physicians in most institutions to determine the optimal treatment path for a particular patient. That's not to imply that FDA drug approvals and clinical practice guidelines, such as the NCCN guidelines, aren't helpful. But these approvals and guidelines don't cover many patients, such as those with certain genetic mutations. And given the large population of patients with these mutations and the myriad of cancer types, sophisticated clinical support tools are needed for patient-specific analysis and decision-making. These tools are also necessary to determine whether a clinical trial might be a viable treatment for a patient. The identification of the potentially relevant, let alone the most relevant clinical trial for a patient is a highly complex matter. The patient's molecular profile and clinical attributes must be analyzed against eligibility criteria. And this analysis needs to be timely and at the point of care. Few solutions today combine both molecular and clinical attributes in the selection of trials. This leaves the oncologist and support teams attempting to comb through many trials in a cumbersome and manual manner. Enhancing trial matching tools as part of a comprehensive decision support solution can at least help reduce the barrier to trial enrollment in oncology. And some drugs fail to come to market simply because they can't enroll sufficient numbers in the clinical trials. So these tools may also help address the high clinical trial failure rates, which contribute in part to the cost of targeted and immunotherapies. In cases where a clinical trial is not an option, learning how patients with similar characteristics have done with various treatment protocols becomes critical. In oncology, where the patient truly is an N of one, gathering the so-called patients like me is particularly challenging, as the characteristics must be defined in granular, molecular, and clinical terms. In addition to the rigor required in defining these cohorts, the ability to acquire large enough data sets to draw significant conclusions is no small feat. Again, artificial intelligence-enabled tools are invaluable in supporting therapy selection for these patients. So in conclusion, Hippocrates' recommendations still have remarkable relevance 2,000 plus years later. Declare the past, diagnose the present, foretell the future. We've made tremendous progress in just the past 15 years towards realizing the vision of a holistic approach to healthcare in which all relevant data shape decisions in real time. But precision medicine is appropriately described as a bit of a paradox. On one hand, physicians and researchers seek to characterize small populations of patients to the level of a single person. On the other hand, achieving the desired level of precision requires a medical system that can learn from backgrounds of many, many people. The promise of precision medicine will be realized through the creation of a learning system that is built on big data. This system will capture, structure, curate, and then analyze the data to provide intelligence at the point of decision making. And this system will be constantly growing and updated with new information and insights. Each patient's journey will be recorded into the health record in such a way that it will help inform precision treatments for future patients. While there is general agreement that the use of broad genomic and clinical data sets can significantly improve how healthcare stakeholders make decisions, expanding its use will require action by multiple stakeholders. Sophisticated technology platforms will need to be built to manage and analyze data in a rapid and low-cost fashion. High-impact use cases, such as diagnosis and treatment of cancer, will need to be focused upon. Perhaps most importantly, the big data problem will need to be, at least in part, addressed. Obstacles include various legal requirements and policies, unstructured critical data, and a mix of technical platforms both within and across health systems. Projects that are designed to standardize data fields and to aggregate high-quality genomic and clinical data sets are in various stages of development and execution, but time will tell whether and to what extent these projects will be successful. In the short term, it'll be critical to prioritize the problems and the questions that one wants these systems to solve and answer. In this way, the data that needs to be gathered to perform the highest value functions and to answer the most important questions can be defined and gathered. Finally, a cautionary note. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are not perfect, nor should they be perceived as a standalone silver bullet solution for healthcare. Over-promotion of and over-reliance upon machine learning and computer algorithms could actually be detrimental to clinical care. So understanding what the model is designed to do, and probably more importantly, what it's not designed to do, will be vital. Done right, these models will augment the clinician's intelligence, experience, and judgment, and enhance the clinician-patient encounter. Rather than machine versus human, our efforts need to be about optimizing the human physician and researcher so that patient care is advanced by leveraging these incredible medical and technological breakthroughs. With that, I'll open up the floor to take your questions and listen to your comments on this topic. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, thank you for that very interesting talk. So I wanted to address the promise of precision medicine, and in particular, there's another barrier, which is insurers. And I'm worried that no matter what precision medicine tells us about what treatment is best for each person, the insurers aren't necessarily going to want to pay because they have step therapy, which is one size fits all, try this medication, then try that medication, etc. And so what do you do to convince insurers that your big data said you have to try this and you have to try this first, no matter how expensive it is?
It's a great question, and I would tell you that as I was pointing out in the prepared remarks, that challenge really starts with the fact that the majority of patients can't be adequately treated in the case of cancer by virtue of following on-label drug approvals and published guidelines such as the NCCN guidelines. So that doesn't even get a bare majority of patients addressed, these on-label and NCCN guideline subset of patients. So it is, in fact, the majority of patients for which there are no, clear lines of treatment, and oftentimes the first and the second lines, if one were to produce big data and clinical results, would be called out as being ineffective and not a good use of anyone's time, money, energy. We're going to have to collectively, and this is why it is such a collaborative effort, build the evidence that shows that there are better treatments. I think that it'll always be the case from the payer standpoint where they're going to follow their historic practices likely until that evidence is produced. As that evidence is produced and more effective treatments and more aligned cost measures can be put forth, then they're going to be willing to listen to that. The one bit of maybe optimism that I would share with you is, unlike a lot of other healthcare fields, this is actually an instance where I've been exposed to a bit of a more proactive payer, where they understand that they have a big problem and that these treatments are inadequate. And if they're blowing through first and second lines of treatment that are ineffective, that's not good spend from their perspective either. So using big data and providing the research and the effectiveness and efficacy of these treatments for these patients can make the case out to adjust their decision making. But there's a lot of work to do on that front.
Thank you. To what extent do you see blockchain being used to help develop the data sets and to maintain the records from patients? We've heard some talk about that, but I don't know where it's at this point within the medical community.
Yeah, and I may turn that question over to someone in this room that has more information about that particular technology. I would tell you that all of the analytics that are quite mature and capable of doing what's necessary in this space are impeded at this point in time by just getting access to high quality clinical and genomic data. The genomic data I don't worry too much about because there's a lot of energy moving in that direction. But harvesting this clinical data is no easy chore, and that's what our space, the involvement that I've had has been focused on. But if someone else has a better response on the blockchain question, I'll open that up and we'll pass the microphone.
Thank you. I was wondering, is there a single improvement that you believe would have the most positive impact on the usefulness of the patient data?
I think that if you could get the stakeholders to support it, the fastest way to advance this capability would be some kind of harmonizing of the key clinical data elements. There are efforts to do so. There's an effort known as M-Code, which is ASCO-based, and I think that they're on the right ocean with that, but what you're essentially doing is trying to get buy-in from a whole bunch of stakeholders to say, this defined field of data are the ones that we're going to go after, and now we want you, healthcare providers, for instance, to push your electronic health record vendors to build their solutions in accordance with these data fields, and then furthermore, we're going to want your clinicians and others within the healthcare system to enter those data fields and potentially to have hard stops to ensure that those data fields, high quality data is entered. If you think about it, probably the highest quality data that's out there right now is the registry data, because that has been mandated at the state and federal level. And so they've pushed institutions over the last many years to, at least at the point of diagnosis, submit clean clinical data as it relates to these cancer patients when they are diagnosed. But those are very, they're ubiquitous, but they're shallow data sets, and so they probably help announce more questions than they answer. It still is a move in the right direction, but to the extent that that kind of uniformly accepted data set could be adopted, then you'd really be able to power the capabilities of these technologies. So for instance, if that data set was commonly followed and it had the key genomic and clinical fields that would allow for accelerated definition to what the right treatment path is for those patient like me cases where the guidelines and on-label approvals don't get you to an answer, that could be really powerful, because then the machine learning would be able to figure out what protocols are working best with these similar patients. It would also power the filling of any of the clinical trials on the enrollment front, because all of those critical data fields would be known, and so very immediately, as that eligibility criteria was laid out, you could go find those patients. Ultimately, you could do that in a much more proactive way, because the diagnostics clearly are going to move upstream. So I would say if there was one effort that we could all get behind and push forward, it would be a more harmonized approach to the data fields. The alternative to that is, again, you're going in manually to lab reports, pathology reports, and the like, and abstracting these key data fields out. We've had conversations with, best-in-class institutions that will tell us that they cannot tell you what stage the cancer patient is in. It's buried in a physician's note. You know, other big institutions will come forward and they'll have pharmaceutical companies that say, we're looking for patients for enrollment of this, you know, key clinical trial, and here are the clinical and the genomic attributes, and big institutions will take a swag at how many of those patients they think that they have within their system. So it really is a limiter at this point in time.
Thank you for your presentation. Two distinct questions. One is big data seems to have great promise for helping solve another problem, that is the whole reimbursement problem, the whole effort to change from fee-for-service to value-based payment. Can you describe what big data is doing in the reimbursement area? The second thing is a distinct question. You mentioned that one database is the chemicals called genes. You know, there are 4 bases, but there's a second set of chemicals, and I wondered if that's being considered at all, which is food. Food is, of course, chemical as well. So the genes are in food, and that's a big determinant of what they do and don't do.
Absolutely. The second of those questions, you know, these exogenous factors it's becoming understood, and that's why I used the first quote from 2,400 years ago. It is now well understood that the outcomes on the health front are so multifactorial, and I think that I've read articles and published scientific studies that will roughly say that maybe the clinical and the genomic is half the equation, right? And then it's everything else, it's lifestyle, it's food, you name it, is baked in there. That's a huge big data challenge, right? I mean, if you think about the storage of the data and the machine learning that it's going to take to sort through all of those patterns to ultimately identify something that is driving inferior outcome in a health context, there's a whole lot of work to do. I think that work will begin in our lifetime, but I think it'll extend well past our lifetime. So I think that there is a lot there. I mean, the environment, exercise, nutrition, sleep, you name it, you know, and all the big data companies are going to be looking to grab that and monetize it to the extent that they can crack the code and start figuring it out. In the shorter term, I think that the clinical, you know, more narrowly defined clinical and genomic data is where the focus will be. But again, I agree with you. I think that we're going to get more and more sophisticated, and you know, maybe 3,000 years after Hippocrates' quote finally get to the point where we can realize the full promise. Your first question again was
Big data being used for helping solve the problem of reimbursement.
Yeah, good. That's a great question. I think that you know, it still is the minority of reimbursements that are value-based. I don't know if that number is currently around 25-ish%. Still the rest fee-for-service, and I think that big data is a huge part of the equation of migrating to these more sophisticated value-based reimbursement systems, let alone some of the opportunities within population health. And I would point out that probably the biggest missing piece, using again the example of cancer care, is outcomes and patient-reported outcomes in particular. That data is not in existence in a way that it needs to be. And if one wants to think more holistically about prophylactic addressing of diseases and prevention of disease and then early detection and treatment of diseases all the way through, you have to get to the other end of that chronology and capture these patient-reported outcomes. So I think that That's another area where I think if the solution was packaged up and brought to the payers, whether they're government or private pay, they would love to have it, but it doesn't exist in a fully built out way at this point in time. And again, I believe within the context of oncology, the patient-reported outcomes is probably the biggest piece that one could create some value with by pulling together. I think that we will make progress on that one in the coming years.
Hi.
I'm sorry, you got the...
Okay. Could you comment on the challenge of intellectual property rights and licensing rights to the data, and how the sometimes competing rights of the providers might, how they can jive with the interests of those who want to monetize and commercialize the efforts here in that precision medicine?
And I think that in this case, the kind of the barrier as it relates to intellectual property is seemingly a little bit less oriented towards patentability. A lot of these algorithms are abstractions, and the race is to get the data. That race being won starts with the consents and access to the data. In the case of our business, it flows by virtue of the BAA that allows us post-consent then to have access to the data. And I think that, that whole area of the law is well developed enough and understood to where I don't really see it as a barrier. The practical side of it is a whole different story, and this is kind of what I think you're getting at is most of the folks in the equation that hold this data beyond the patient believe that there is huge value in that data. And everyone's convinced that they're well positioned to monetize that data. And it's interesting, within the various stakeholder groups, if you go and you talk to healthcare providers and you want to talk about having access to data to build a data sharing network that can redound to the benefit of their providers, clinicians, and ultimately their patients, they're pretty receptive about that. De-identifying the data, putting it into a lake, maturing the machine learning, grabbing opportunities to learn from the treatment of these patients and the survival rates, doing comparative effectiveness studies by virtue of that richer data pool. That conversation goes pretty well. It's not a 1 month conversation. It's more like a 12 to 18 month conversation by the time you work through legal and the security groups and cover off the data privacy issues. But there's an openness to that. If that conversation starts with, we want to provide you this solution and get access to this data and then pivot around and monetize that data in the context of the pharmaceutical companies, usually doesn't go very far, at least not initially. If you go to the biobank side of these hospitals where they're holding these specimens, they're open to that. They're open to gathering a revenue stream by virtue of some access to these specimens that they're storing, and even using those specimens for genomic sequencing to advance the cause within the research world. So, but I think that there's been so much published and talked about the value of the big data, and again, because it's matured in other industries out ahead of healthcare, these healthcare decision makers have become pretty sensitized to the big opportunity out there. I'm pretty convinced that many, for whatever this window is going to represent by way of opportunity, probably are going to struggle to actually move forward and take advantage and monetize that. But they believe that they can. They often believe that not only do they have the data, but they can develop the technology in-house and then monetize on their own. I think that that'll be the rare institution that can develop the technology and move all the way to monetization. But it's an obstacle right now. like I said, for our company, we've kind of phased out any of the pharmaceutical monetization type conversation or relationship development. We want to be patient-centric. We want to bring a solution that makes a difference and helps these providers in the here and now. And the ask that we have is that they contribute the data so that it redounds to the benefit of everyone that's using that solution, but not beyond that.
This is more of like an ethical question, I guess, but how do you see big data applied in healthcare, either furthering or addressing disparities in patient care?
That's a really good question, and I would tell you that some of the work that I did with my prior company was very focused on healthcare disparities. It's another multifactorial challenge with both conscious and unconscious biases sort of at the front end of that challenge. But irrespective of the disease category or the therapeutic area of treatment that you pick, there are remarkable differences in the access to health care among insular minority groups within this country. I mean, what I would hope is that big data is capable, if it's well structured, of taking any of the ambiguity out of that question and presenting it to decision makers as a fact-based reality, because it is. The studies, whether it's cardio care or orthopedic care or cancer care, dictate that that's the case. As I said, it's not an easy thing to solve, but we need a comprehensive plan to get after it. Some of that is education at the patient level. Some of that is education at the physician and provider system level. And some of it is going to come down to, again, just as we were talking about earlier, how do we get the payers to pay for it? Putting the evidence in front of them to say that this intervention at this point in time brings about a better health outcome and puts this person, back in a productive state in the economy as a wage earner or needing less care than they would otherwise need. But there's a group within the orthopedic field called Movement is Life, and it was something that I was deeply involved with in my time with Zimmer Biomet to get after culturally competent care. And there's an excellent book that's published by a doctor named Augustus White, who's a retired spine surgeon out of Harvard, called Seeing Patients. And I would recommend a website in the first case and a read of that book in the second case, and would be glad to talk to you further about it because that's something I care deeply about.
My question is, you mentioned the importance of clinics collaborating and consenting. Do you think eventually the future of this, or the most effective way to get them to comply, would be from eventual government mandate or policy, or is that more of a profit-driven reality?
Well, I think that if it was centrally driven in that way, it would be effective. You'd have a lot of people choking on that. I think that the reaction of physicians to electronic health record systems is a good example of that, and you'd be going at them with another round, and that's the struggle here. Those electronic health records are systems that are more built for reimbursement, right? And so all the effort and the billions and billions of dollars, and it is a platform that can help us move forward, but one would have thought that after all that effort, that these point-of-care support solutions would have been built into it, and they just aren't at all. And in fact, when you talk to these physicians, oftentimes they'll look at a solution like ours and they'll say, don't even make it look like an electronic health record solution because, I'm allergic to it. We've been banging data into that thing since I started practicing, or for the last 15 years or whatever, and I get nothing of value back out of that. And so we kind of have to avoid even user interfaces that make them break out in hives because it reminds them of those systems. I think if the government mandated this, pushed it in a similar way to the electronic health records, because I think that's the analog to what you propose, we may be glad that happened 10 years later, but I think it'd be a painful process in the form of implementation. That's why, the point that I made near the end of the talk is one that's worth reinforcing. I think to the extent that you could apply the 80-20 rule, and let's say in the case of cancer care, that you don't go for 300, 500 fields. Let's talk about the 20, 30, 50 fields that can make a huge difference. And they're out there. And let's code those in. And let's do that in a harmonized way so that all the vendors implement, that approach. And now we can de-identify those data sets, pull them into a lake, and make a whole lot of good things happen with those. That might be a sort of an iterative step of government intervention to say, we're going to do it, but we're going to do it wisely. We're going to start with 20, 30, 50 fields. Everyone's got to do that. Here's how that's going to be used, and we'll phase it in over, some reasonable time period. On the other end of that, I think we'd all be happy that we did it. Oh, yeah, I guess I've got to get
I had a
microphone
question.
down too.
Yeah,
Oops, I'm sorry.
Yeah, what role, if any, is the NIH playing in your in the data, big data, or or will they? I don't know.
Yeah, I think meaningful, and I would tell you that both NIH and the regulatory groups, I think, have pushed a lot of resources and some pretty innovative thinking into this space, real world evidence being a prime example of that, these accelerated approvals being a prime example of that. And so those initiatives really inform some of the research priorities that NIH will then fund. I think that, government's doing pretty good things in this space, relative to criticisms that you might apply in other spaces. I do believe that the real world evidence initiative, and obviously all the opportunities that are opened up by virtue of the genomic sequencing, it's so brand new by way of discovery and opportunity to develop these solutions and better understand, that each of these cancer patients are 1 in a billion. So let's start getting after some of the themes that can make a difference. And from what I've seen don't have the expertise to judge it, but the conversations that I've had with world-renowned people that do have the expertise to judge it, they're complimentary of the efforts on those various fronts. They just want it to go faster, obviously, as always. Yeah.
We could probably squeeze one last question in here quickly.
Thank you. So just a question. You mentioned that natural language processing has advanced, but not to the point that it obviates the need for human intervention. If we were looking at 12 to 50 fields that we wanted to pull out of the data, is natural language processing to a state in which it could accomplish that?
It could help. And does everyone here know what natural language processing is? So this is, if you picture it as sort of this dictionary or semantic guide, and you had a paragraph in front of you and natural language processing was applied to it, it would tag terms and then try to pull in the context in which that term appears the meaning and value to take, in that form. The paragraph is unstructured data and structure it. So picture that paragraph sort of getting translated into a spreadsheet where the fields are populated with the key terms. And so if you were to envision a dictated pathology report with NLP technology applied to it, it would tag these terms, and all of a sudden you would have fields that are getting populated with tumor site, tumor size, tumor dimensions, other relevant information. And in the case of that, the pathology report, NLP is getting pretty good, but it needs to be tuned up and deployed sort of institution by institution. So if it's an institution that has one way of doing their pathology reports, that's really helpful, because then you can figure out, what's working and what isn't working and bring your accuracy rates way up. What's harder is something, so in a pathology report, pretty good. In physician's notes, less mature. It's just harder because the variation is so much more broad, and the data that you're trying to capture is buried in there in different ways, and oftentimes the terminology used by the different physicians varies even within the same institution. And so if you know exactly what you're looking for and the source document that you're getting is structured in a common way, then NLP is quite helpful. If those preconditions don't exist, you're back to individuals digging through and abstracting manually. But I think what's realistic is to sort of, again, what are the 30 fields that would make a huge difference? Among those, which ones can we pull directly because they're already structured and just in automated feeds? Which ones are NLP technology able to go get in an unstructured state and structure it? Which ones maybe on the next slot on the continuum are not capable of being completely automated with NLP, but maybe NLP can help locate, within a report, the particular area that now that manual abstractor needs to go look at, and now record that. And then, the determination, back to the prior discussion about maybe we can fill in another 10 of these fields by just hard coding them and saying, from this date forward, we're going to start including these in the electronic health records so that we can automate the feed of those key data fields. I think some intelligent approach, kind of step by step, can take us a long ways.
All right, so we're going to move our discussion out to our reception, but please join me in thanking.
Thanks.